Resilience is not just getting back up after you've been knocked down or how you recover from setbacks. While that is a big part of it, the bigger picture is how you adapt and thrive amidst that disruption and chaos. But this word has been thrown around so much in the last decade that it has lost its meaning. Welcome to Manage Chaos Podcast, where we give you the startup business rundown in less time than it takes for you to get to work. I'm Rachel Anderson.
And I'm Katrina Purcell.
And today we are redefining resilience for your business. All right, resilience is a big word, and trust me, I've heard it a lot in business over the last decade. But let's start with the very basics like we like to do. What is not resilience in startups?
Yeah, I think the word resilience has been used not only a lot in business, but even just in real life, right? As people recovered from the pandemic and, the word resilient, I feel like gets thrown around a lot, along with grit. So resilience is not just about bouncing back, right? It's not just about recovering from the setback. That is definitely part of it. So let's set the table there. But it's really about how you're anticipating, how you're adapting, and how you're even, in some cases, thriving among disruption, right? And so it's not just about, okay, I got knocked down and I got up, but what did you do when you got back up? I think oftentimes, too, we think of resilience as being somewhat rigid, right? So, sticking to your plan and really being sort of stubborn and obstinate about I'm going to be successful no matter what happens. When in reality, being resilient means you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to pivot. You have to be willing to kind of take new information in and make a change or make an adjustment. Resilience is really about taking new information and how you use that information. It's not about sticking to your path despite being, having warning signals and information thrown your way that shows that path is not really the right path. I think the other thing that people tend to misunderstand is that it's not a solo endeavor. So yes, as a person, you personally can be resilient, but in order for a company to be resilient, it can't just be about the founder's grit. It can't just be about one person choosing to be resilient. It has to really be about building culture and building systems where the entire company or the entire team can really start to weather storms and really understand, number one, why they're weathering those storms, but then number two, what processes they have in place to ensure that they can continue to weather those. If only one person on a team or in a partnership or in a relationship is resilient, the partnership as a whole is not resilient. And I think that can be challenging. It can be very difficult to be someone who is adaptable and who is able to be flexible and be partnered up with someone who's not. I mean, we've all done those school projects or things where we work with someone who has a completely different style than we do. And so it really has to be about creating that culture of resilience.
I think that's interesting, especially you landing on the culture of resilience, because as you were talking about some of these things, I was reflecting on some of the businesses that I've worked with that have really focused on resiliency as sort of some of their core components. And one of the things that I think is underrated is that to be resilient is to also practice it. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a prescription that equals we can avoid it or we will overcome it. And you're touching on all these things like education, employee has to know about it. Practice, they have to be ready to do the thing, right? So with that in mind, what actually is then resilience if these are sort of a lot of the different pieces that are not resilience?
The first thing I would say is really proactive adaptation, right? So creating systems, I'm an ops person, and so I love to talk about systems, but creating systems, having them in place to sort of identify, respond to changes, understand what you're going to do before you're faced with a crisis. So knowing that you have technology in place that can adapt and that will be able to take to the next step, right? And so I think sometimes in startups, we tend to design for what we have right now, as opposed to thinking about, okay, what am I going to have 6 months from now? What am I going to have 18 months from now? That I need to make sure I've got systems in place that are going to grow and expand with me, that if a crisis was to come, I'm going to be able to lean back on those systems. Because in some cases, you don't want to be making in the moment decisions in a crisis without having, that structure in place. The other thing is something we've talked about a lot just on a personal level is continuous learning. So making sure that your environment is an environment where your team is empowered to continually learn. And I think some places where I've seen this done well really is around not only the founder learning, everyone has to be learning. And I think in some cases, we ourselves say, well, I prioritize reading, X number of books, or I prioritize listening to different podcasts. But it's really about sharing that with your team, making sure your team has space to learn, giving them professional development dollars, helping them to know what's useful to spend those professional development dollars on, and making sure that they also know that experimenting is something that they can do, right? And creating guardrails around that. And I think understanding that if someone experiments, that means there are likely to be failures, and how you respond to those failures is extremely important to ensure that your team continues to experiment. But making sure they understand, maybe we don't experiment on things that are external facing. Maybe we don't experiment on things for our biggest client, and understanding where maybe a little bit of play and a little bit of, improving and improving through failure is allowed. The other thing is really embracing uncertainty. I don't know about you, but I'm terrible at this. But it's really about not only tolerating the unknown, but really seeing it as an opportunity. And so for those of us control freaks in the world, this one can be kind of hard because we want to be able to control all the things we can control. And there's obviously certain things that are unknown. But resilience is really around embracing that, understanding that there are certain things that are going to be uncertain. Could you hit it big? Could you not? We were just having a conversation, right? What's going to happen after South by Southwest? We have no idea, and there's a certain level of excitement around that because there's this potential. But I think oftentimes startups get kind of bogged down with the what ifs. And I think it's important to have those systems in place and understand that you have a strong foundation, that you have clear processes, that you've created communication channels, you have a decision-making framework. So even if, let's say, you hit it big after something or you sign a big client, you're able to fall back on those processes and those frameworks. And that allows your team to feel resilient. So it allows them to feel the excitement and then learn the outcome and then say, okay, but that's fine. We're ready for this outcome because we've put all these things in place during a time when it was peaceful and there wasn't a lot going on. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that comes back also to psychological safety, right? The experimentation, allowing your team to speak up about risks, empowering your team to highlight if there's concerns or problems that they see, which really allows you as a founder to then course correct. And that helps to create resiliency because as people see, I've brought an issue, we course corrected, we avoided it, that creates resilience. Creates a resilient team. It creates a team that understands that their opinions and feelings are valid.
So, as you're talking about this, Katrina, I'm going to go off books. I want to talk about something slightly off and then back into kind of our flow. So I, at least 10 years ago now, worked with a team that was working with business continuity plans, which for startups, I don't see a lot of startups that think in those terms. So just to break down that, a business continuity plan essentially is a business backup plan. If something goes wrong, how do you keep business running? And so a lot of times, especially in bigger companies, that is viewed as more of is there a hurricane? Is there an earthquake that keeps you out of a building? Is there a fire? Or maybe is there a global pandemic?
I was just about to say that. Yeah,
I know.
So many plans got put in place because of that pandemic that were created for hurricanes or fires or things like that.
That's right. So there's all these business backup plans of how, your business is going to run as usual, all these things. But as you were chatting in this particular way, I realized that there is a whole different context to resiliency because that's business continuity plans was the answer to resilience before resilience was sexy as a word. Right. So, to be resilient can also be how you keep your business going forward. And in this context, maybe you have 3 really big clients that are basically running you forward and you lose one of those clients. What's the thing that you're going to do to make your business resilient so you don't fold without that 3rd client while you're trying to grow and expand? And so if it's not too much on the spot, can you maybe break down just a tiny bit from like the leader's planning and understanding of the terms perspective into like, okay, Katrina, you're consulting with a small business and they are bought into the idea of resilience. They love this. What are kinds of documents or frameworks or specific conversations like we need fill in the blank in order to have a resilient plan in place to then put into action should they need it?
So the first place that I always come back to is SOPs, or standard
Mhm.
operating procedures, right? And having all those in a centralized location where anyone in your team can access them. So understanding exactly what's being done when, and how things are happening is important. The other piece that I think is really important is understanding that your budget that you've created is a living and breathing document. And if revenue isn't going to hit, having had the conversations initially when you created that budget of what things are you going to limit spending on if the revenue numbers are not there. And oftentimes where I've seen teams struggle here is that, the founder or whoever is leading the charge doesn't want to pull back on anything because they feel like at some point the numbers are going to come. And there is an element of that, right? In sort of being very gung ho on hitting those revenue targets, but there is also a reality to your cash burn that you have to understand what can go, right?
Mhm.
And oftentimes it's not obviously going to be your people. Hopefully that's the last thing. But there should be different levers that you can pull and things that you know ahead of time that if by the end of Q1 we're not hitting our targets, and this is where your KPIs come into play, but if we're not in line to hit those targets, what are the things we're going to reduce spending on in Q2, Q3 in order to help offset that loss? And
I think
having those having those
that's okay.
conversations early on, I think is key because there's not as much emotional attachment to the specific things you might be cutting in those early days, right? It's theoretical. And
Mhm.
so doing that in the early start of creating your budget is very key because then when it comes down to, maybe pulling funding for a project or an event that you really wanted to do, it's more about, oh, this is the plan and I'm pulling the lever because we didn't hit the target, not I'm emotionally attached to this event and it's only in 3 weeks and we can't do that.
That's great. It's almost like a train. What is your caboose budget? The thing that you can lose, and it's just like it's there because it's fun and cute, but like not really necessary. What's your middle car budget? Like, okay, you're getting close to the things that really matter, but like you still have a little wiggle room. What's the engine car budget? Like, we can't knock these off. These have to be
Exactly.
like just to make it go. I think that's so smart. So, what I'm hearing, SOP really helps make your employees resilient, meaning if you lose a really key member, you can bounce back up because you know how they do things, where things
Mm-hmm.
run, how business can grow and expand, especially if you're in like a franchising space. That is so critical. And then budget really makes your programming and kind of road mapping resilient.
Yep.
And then I would even say, adding one in real fast, like you should have a backup customer plan. So if you lose revenue somewhere, whether that's a service or a company or a product maybe or whatever, what are the things that make you money fast? That should be part of your resiliency planning so that you can pull that lever only when really needed. I think those are really good tactical ones. So to kind of wrap us up for kind of our big question about how do we get resilient and ready, just why are we having this conversation now? Why 2025 resiliency matters kind of conversations?
So I think, we've been talking even in 2024 around sort of economic uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
That, this year the Fed raised rates. They're now in the process of potentially lowering those rates, but capital's not free anymore, right? It definitely, there's a cost of doing business. And so I think there's a level of economic uncertainty that requires resilience. It requires you to have a mindset that you can adapt and you can adjust if there are changes in the market. So let's say, for instance, you're not getting funding that you were expecting to get. How are you adjusting, right? How are you ensuring that your team can still function if the funding doesn't come through?
Mhm.
The other piece of this is actually, it's way more exciting, but it's the rapid technological advancements, right? So, I mean, goodness gracious, how can you even stay ahead of the curve with AI? Um, but really around being resilient in how you're developing your technology and how you're developing your services in how you're coaching your team, educating your team, and then again in evolving customer expectations, right? And so the market is changing, the demands of customers are changing. They require flexibility. They really want to be at the center of everything that you're doing. And so being resilient means being able to be a step ahead, but then also understand that if you fall a step back, that you can very quickly adapt to those customer needs.
Well, this has been so good, Katrina. I have loved so many of the nuggets. And thank you for letting me take that unexpected detour. This has been the Manage Chaos podcast. We're so glad that you're with us for this season 2 episode. We have a lot more coming, so definitely hit that follow, like, subscribe wherever you listen. And we will be back next week with another fresh episode on the Manage Chaos podcast.